Hello, everyone, and welcome to Past Forward, brought to you by BlueSky Privacy. My name is Teresa Troester Falk, and I'm the founder of BlueSky Privacy. We're a privacy and data protection compliance company. But our series in Past Forward is a new blog and video interview series that veers away from discussions of privacy and data protection law and operational practices, and is trying to create a space for us to have more of a human conversation to explore this moment in time, this incredible moment in our history as we enter the age of AI, and sit with all of the excitement and the fears and the terror and the hopes that we're feeling, and looking for insights from classic works, seminal works, trying to call out those timeless insights to guide us at this moment in time. And I'm delighted to be having a conversation today with Leah Edmonds. Leah, I have known since she was a baby. She is the daughter of cherished friends of mine from university days, but the truth is we hadn't connected very much at all since your middle school years. And about a month ago, you reached out to me in the context of talking about law school. So what I thought was going to be a simple sort of catch up and talk about law school turned into a fascinating and unexpected, delightful conversation about your master's work in philosophy and your major research paper, which got me deeply excited and inspired lots of new thinking of my own. So we're here today to engage with you on your research paper. And Leah, it was a very, as it can be in philosophy, very specific and maybe esoteric topic involving Heidegger's views or changing views on funerary practices. So let's just start with what inspired this, what inspired the topic in the first place?
So it's what is typical for academic research papers. There's a lot of factors at play. Some of them more personal, and some kind of arbitrary to do with what I was reading and who I was talking to at the time. So a lot of factors to do with timing. So one thing was, in high school, I happened to have had a teacher who was really interested in ritual, and that's what she had done some grad school work on. And as an assignment, she had us come up with a rite of passage, just invent one. And since then, I've just been fascinated with all kinds of rites of passage. And I really sort of rituals of all kinds really pique my interest, and I'm very interested in what they do for us as individuals and as groups. So yeah, when it came to choosing a topic for this paper, I knew I was interested in ritual. Then there was a personal event in my life in and around when I started grad school. So it was during COVID that I started my studies at Concordia. And my mentor from undergraduate actually passed away very suddenly in October of that year. So I just started this new program. And because it was COVID, we weren't able to have an in-person funeral. So it certainly wasn't possible to see a body or speak to her relatives or these shared friends and colleagues that we had. And there was a Zoom event where a number of her former students shared stories, but on some level I found this was better than nothing, but it was also not really satisfying at all to have a funeral over Zoom. And so that did really just get me thinking about what do funerals do for us? How do they have sort of ethical import? Why psychologically do we need them? How do they help to foster healthy grieving process. So yeah, so that was those were two pieces: the ritual piece and this personal loss of Dr. Deborah Cook was her name. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm deeply
Yeah.
sorry for that loss. And thank you for sharing the personal aspect. Maybe later in our conversation, we can hear about your creative ritual from high school. But uh, but this moment, so all of those factors combined in this deeply moving and sad moment led you into this scholarly research with a well-known, arguably one of the most prominent philosophers of all time, Martin Heidegger, and his evolving views on funerary practices. So before we delve into your paper and some of the ideas, you and I talked about addressing the elephant in the room around Heidegger and some of his political views. So I wonder if you might just, at the outset, share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as many people know about Heidegger, he was a member of the Nazi Party. So he was a German writing mainly from the 20s to the 50s and 60s. And during most of that period, he was a member of the Nazi Party as part of his advancement within the university systems. So yeah, so we have to ask the question, and it's a really important question, whether we should write off his philosophy because of this political affiliation. There's plenty of good philosophers to read. So why should we read someone who is clearly so politically problematic? And so this is something I've really grappled with throughout all my engagement with Heidegger. But so I first started reading Heidegger in my undergrad. And the idea was really that you have to read Heidegger as a philosopher if you're going to understand anyone who came later, if you're going to understand Foucault, if you're going to understand some of the work of the later American pragmatists, if you want to understand post-structuralism, all of these major movements in the last 60 years, all influenced by Heidegger. So the original impetus for reading Heidegger was historical, right? You need this background as a philosopher. But I have to say, I just, from the time of reading Being in Time, I found his ideas so intuitive and his vocabulary so rich. I mean, Heidegger's really known for having come up with words really in the German language, building his own words because he felt the need to do that to convey his ideas. And yeah, so I found his work richly poetic, and I couldn't get myself away from him, even though I felt a certain ambivalence. So anyway, that's my hope, is that I wouldn't want to lose this sort of the insights and the yeah, well, I mean, sort of the insight and the passion and the possible intellectual and poetic fruit that might come of a thinker like this.
And I'm glad that you didn't, where we've spoken about our ability to separate the person from the politics, the philosophy from the politics, and that's what you did in your paper, and built out this uniquely inspiring range of thought. So without going into the scholarly weeds, because your paper is over 60 pages and it's available publicly, and I hope that many of you who are listening will delve into it because it's fascinating. But here we're going to call out some of the key concepts and terms that you describe, these beautiful terms that Heidegger develops to show his evolution of thinking. But his early work, he talks a lot about anxiety, and I think that is something that we can relate to deeply, you know, as a community, as a world, as humanity at this moment in time. So can you talk to us about his views on anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So anxiety, really, really central theme for his early work, Being in Time. So Heidegger thinks that anxiety is central and and essential to the human experience, that all of our other emotions that we feel and our impetus for going about existence has to do with this sort of bubbling anxiety that is just always there. And oops, sorry, I'm gonna have to pause and plug in.
No worries.
Sorry, I forget how.
So
And
coming back.
yeah, so most of the time, Heidegger thinks that what we do is we repress this anxiety. And the way he describes anxiety is that it doesn't have to do with anything in particular. Anxiety can manifest in very specific fears, but more philosophically speaking, structurally speaking, this anxiety just has to do with being thrown into a world that we didn't choose, that it evolves around us in ways that we cannot predict or control. So it's a feeling of kind of alienation. I am this being, I am me, I can make some choices, but really, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to everything that's going on. And I'm invested in the world, but I just have so little control over it. So yes, this anxiety.
So that is something we can hugely identify with at this
Yeah,
moment in time.
of
And you
course.
made, in your paper, you make the connection to the corresponding view around authenticity.
Yes.
You
Yeah, so
describe that
authenticity
connection. Yeah.
is another big piece here. So throughout Heidegger's work, he's really, really interested in finding a relationship to being or otherwise put an attitude towards existence that is really truthful. And so in Being in Time, he calls this authenticity.
Mhm.
And he thinks that the only way to really reach authenticity is to stop fleeing from anxiety, to stop repressing it or keeping oneself busy all the time, but instead, when it crops up, we should take some time and just lean into it.
So I love this. I'm going to stop you just for a moment because we're thinking about these in the backdrop of today. And I find it fascinating that Merriam-Webster's dictionary word of the year last year was authentic.
Mhm.
So in the spirit of this being passed forward, I know we could talk for hours, but we're going to kind of move from that point in his time. So that early thinking around anxiety and authenticity, which is rich to explore. And in some of his later works, he continues to develop or shift, you can tell us, and starts to use the term enframing, particularly in the context of technology. So tell us about that. What is enframing and how is it relevant for us?
Yeah, so enframing is a kind of attitude towards the world. For Heidegger, like a modal way of being that has to do with technology. And Heidegger often uses the Greek root of technology, techne, in relation to enframing. And so the world, when we are in the mode of enframing, really appears to us as resources to be exploited. And specifically, they provide us with value that can be measured quantitatively. And so we can see how this is almost inevitable, right? We have, as human beings, we need to control our environment, and that has to do with making predictions, extracting energy. This is why we as the human species have really succeeded evolutionarily, is because we have this this kind of rational ability to be rational, to be quantitative, etc. But Heidegger is worried that in the modern era, so especially beginning in and around when he's writing, that this attitude has become so pervasive that we've lost the ability to take other attitudes towards the world.
Hmm.
So we have
And
become.
remind us what time period he was writing in.
So he started writing in the 20s. Being in Time was in the 20s. Oh, I'm so bad with dates. I can't give you the actual dates. So Being in Time was the 20s. He becomes interested in technology, especially post-World War II. So the essay concerning technologies we see in the 40s. So it's definitely more of a later
Because it
interest.
sounds like you're talking about today.
Yes. Yeah.
And
And
we're talking about the 1940s and 50s.
for sure. And I mean, we could say that like what Heidegger was concerned about has just been amplified over the time since he was writing. And that's why his writing is still relevant. And he was at an interesting kind of juncture, right? Because he definitely grew up in the early 1900s in rural Germany, where it was mostly sort of an agricultural community. People went to church. He actually went to seminary school before he started studying philosophy. So he had a very, very traditional beginning, and he began to see all these changes to do with modernity, globalization, like the expansion of the economy, people losing their farms, all of that sort of classic urbanization, industrialization stuff. And there's that really great example from the question concerning technology, where he is fascinated by rivers and the way that rivers create place, and how communities always seem to have sort of erupted at the side of rivers. And he experienced the damming of the Rhine River for power. And so we really saw this as an example of framing how we can look at the river as a poetic entity, as being in relation to the gods, relation to travel, relation to community. It can have a name. For example, the Danube. The original name for the Danube is the Ister, which is the name of a goddess. And so there's this way we can personify beings in the world and give them stories and resonance. Or we can take this attitude, which is in framing, where we think of it in terms of the number of watts of electricity it can produce. So
And you used when you and I were discussing this, used the concept of the flattening of reality, something that is used in scholarly research to describe that.
Yeah.
Flattening of reality. And that, just as you talked about, that's exactly what it felt like from this beautiful, expansive description of nature to this quantifiable. Yes.
Right. We don't have to be elite philosophers with tons of jargon to have that feeling. I think we often feel it, especially when we're in our jobs crunching numbers all day, that sort of sense of despair. Like, is that it? Is everything just numbers?
Yeah.
Well,
so this leads into the next concept I just find so gorgeous and beautiful, and how you build it out in your paper. And it's the concept of poetic dwelling. And this is, I think, the trajectory of Heidegger's evolving views. We're not even talking about actually his specific views on funerals, but it connects. But describe to us what is poetic dwelling, and the connection to this kind of flattening of reality and to where we want to be. Yeah.
So I mentioned before that Heidegger is really, really interested in what a meaningful relationship to being is, like a truthful relationship to being would be. And in Being in Time, he uses the word authenticity. And as I argue in the paper, authenticity really takes a transformation throughout his career. And what I really think is it turns into poetic dwelling.
Mhm.
And what poetic dwelling is essentially the antidote to enframing, to what he calls Gestell. And it is a transformation of this modal being, of seeing the world in terms of, well, what philosophers would often call instrumental rationality. So the world as tools, instruments, energy that can be quantified, to beings with depth and integrity and beauty. And really the key to poetic dwelling is re-injecting a sense of hiddenness into the world.
Mhm.
So there's this of mystery. It's a bit of a cliche, but what Heidegger really wants to emphasize is that when we think of ourselves in terms of limited, mortal beings with kind of finite epistemological access to the world becomes richer because we can get little glimpses here and there of what we don't know. And this is really the opposite of the attitude of enframing, that would tell us that, oh, we know everything and we can put a number to it. So poetic dwelling is a way of being in the world that is humble, that is gracious, and that is grateful, and that approaches beings in terms of what they could be in their essence and in their individuality, and not how they could be useful to us.
So, and to go back to your initial point that it's the antidote to this experience of enframing, where reality flattens in the face of technology, the corresponding aspect is it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
That
And
if we create spaces for that reflective, gracious, open to mystery, we create a space for
and
ourselves.
that's precisely it. Heidegger actually calls this the way out. The way out of Gestell is through poetic dwelling, and it's not easy, right? So much of our attitude it seems to come from the world, like things present themselves in certain ways, and habitually things present themselves to us in terms of instrumentality and numbers. And so it is hard to find a way in poetically, but there's always avenues for this. And
So let's talk about this, because what
yeah,
you're saying, numbers and instruments, I mean, this is our world in spades today, and
yeah,
the advent of AI. And many, I feel, I mean, what inspired my series was this experience I'd had over the years of having conversations about new technologies and the future of technology with friends and family, and seeing, in some cases, the look of excitement, but in many cases, the look of doom and despair and fear, and knowing that I didn't believe that it had to be that way. And so exploring these seminal works that provide timeless insights. I mean, as you're talking about Heidegger and his viewpoints, it could seem that he's a philosopher of today. I mean, the issues, yes, there's a nuance, a huge nuance, but the same issues are being discussed. So coming back to this notion, poetic dwelling being an antidote to enframing. Or the way you said it, it's the way out. It's the way out of our fear and our despair and the sort of flattening of reality. What actually was Heidegger's view of funerals at this time, in his most evolved thinking, as a
yeah.
ritual?
I guess I can only get at this by comparing what he was saying and in Being in Time. So Being in Time, there's really famous argument or proposition that in order to be authentic, we need to we have this attitude where we think and anticipate our own death. We need to cultivate an awareness of our mortality, and he calls us being towards death. So the most horrible, absurd thing that humans face, all humans face, is this knowledge of our own death. And I think it's true that most animals don't have this. It's really unique to humans who have this vision of time, access to the past, access to the future. And so, insofar as we have access, we project onto the future, we know that we're going to die. And that is like, you can get deeper every time you think of that. It is just so horrific and anxiety inducing. And yeah. And so anyway, so Heidegger thinks we should have that. The only way to truly cultivate a deep, rich way towards being, we have to be thinking about our mortality. And in Being in Time, he really figures this in an abstract way. He thinks that the only way we can get at this authenticity is really imagining our own deaths, sitting on our own and doing these almost stoic-like exercises. And that makes me laugh. It seems like so typical for a philosopher to really privilege intellectualization and abstraction and this and that. So anyway, Heidegger really figures it as an independent exercise. And he's also worried about funerary practices as being a way of hiding the reality of death. So, and I think this actually comes from Nietzsche. So I don't know if many of your listeners will know of Nietzsche, another controversial but also very important philosopher who was very critical of Christianity for projecting this afterlife, which is supposed to, as Nietzsche thought, make it easier to confront the idea of death, make it less difficult, whereas it actually takes away from the urgency of life if you really believe in an afterlife. So anyway, initially Heidegger is very skeptical of funerary practices. He thinks they're inauthentic because they're evasive of the truth of death. But then about 20 years later, Heidegger wrote about Antigone. So Antigone is a figure from ancient Greek tragedy. And Antigone, in her story, she is a hero for conducting a funerary rite over the corpse of her brother against the rule of law in Thebes. I guess it's Thebes. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think. And Heidegger really likes this figure and really talks of her as a certain poetic ideal. And I found this, so strange, because here she is, she probably has this belief in an afterlife that is motivating her. And yet Heidegger finds her to be so heroic. And so that's one part of this transition, is like being critical of Christian funerary practices, but highly interested in the figure of Antigone and this more pagan Greek funerary practice. And then there's one other piece that was another clue for me. He writes an essay called Building Dwelling Thinking. Again, I want to say it's the early 50s, so even after the Antigone work, where he refers to the Totenbaum, which is a type of
coffin.
A coffin.
Yeah,
a tree trunk
very
coffin
simple tree trunk coffin.
that would be kept in the home all of the time and be used for all of the various family members who would pass away. And so this is an artifact, part of a traditional set of funerary practices that would just be in the home all the time. And it was quite clear that he thought of this as being a very potent way to cultivate authenticity, or sort of a sense of,
by always being reminded of death.
always being reminded of death by something
Through an
very,
artifact
very
in your home. Yeah.
So so we can see there's kind of a profound difference, and a mellowing out, and a kind of a dispersal of his elitism from this stoic, oh, I'm thinking so hard about death, it'll make me authentic, to, oh, look at these German peasants, they sort of got it, even though they weren't thinking about it, because they had this artifact in their home that they
So
would
correct me if I'm wrong, but this was part of, this connects to the poetic dwelling aspect that
yeah.
in the face. So now we're talking about the 50s. It's post World War II, and it's the damming of the Rhine and this industrialization of warfare and this search,
And
the way out, as
and
you said, through
not on,
this reflective.
not only this, but the industrialization and the the bureaucracy of death, right? I mean, you just look at the Holocaust. This was the industrialization of death, of murder. And so so there's this one way of looking at death in terms of numbers and efficiency, right? And then this entirely other way, which is the poetry of the coffin that is carved by hand and has been used by a family for generations. And anyway, so that
So
was
with
what
that
Heidegger was
notion,
interested in recovering. Yeah.
yes, and you build that out in depth and layers in your paper. And it was that when I got to that section that I reached back to you. You know, we'll come back to how we started our conversation. We're going to talk about law school, and it's like, I don't want to read your paper. I'm interested into like I just got so inspired that this is our way out. This is relevant for today. And from what you wrote and how you built out Heidegger's evolving views on death and the rituals around death, and this gorgeous concept of poetic dwelling, I felt that what we need, at least some of us need at this moment in time, as we enter this exciting but also terrifying age of AI, is a collective funeral, a universal funeral, a metaphorical funeral, where there are spaces that we can pause and reflect as communities. And I don't even know if we can articulate what we're losing, but there's this sense that we're losing something as we're entering this new age. And so I asked you to, think about, what do you think about this concept of like building on all your work, like a metaphorical funeral, a community funeral at this moment in time? And not everybody needs it, but there are, again, so many who are deeply feeling the flattening of reality, the anxiety around living in this world we can't control. And yes, it's building on this concept of the way out. So if we could kind of close things a little with your thoughts on what a collective funeral or metaphorical funeral might look like, or what kind of spaces we might create. That's probably not a fair question, but
No, I mean, I think it's a beautiful idea, and it's certainly kind of a pleasure to riff off of, even if I don't have a really concrete or well thought out answer. So on the one hand, I think part of the grief that people are feeling right now really does come from inframing. They don't call it that, but the flattening out. There's a certain panic or despair that we feel like maybe there is not a way out of this. Maybe this is it. Maybe it is just all numbers and energy, and I'm just part of this machine that's chugging along. And to that, well, I think, well, I mean, and this is exactly what Heidegger, I think, why he wrote, is because this profound flattening was affecting him. And well, I think the answer to that is just saying is we are humans. We are more than numbers, and we are more than numbers, and the way that we imbue meaning onto the world is far more rich than numeric. And so or there's more possibilities for imbuing meaning than purely in a numbered way.
I mean, there's many who believe that in this new era, as tools take over the monotonous tasks of our day, that we could correspondingly see a renaissance in arts and culture and a flourishing of the human experience in a new way, and ironically find ourselves more deeply connected as humans and in community, because it is our humanity that uniquely binds us, not the technology.
Yeah. And this is not like an official Heideggerian position, but there's other thinkers around his time that think in these terms, that what we really need to do is free up time. If we want to have richer, more humane lives, well, ideally we do need to free up time. We need shorter work weeks. We need more automation, so that we can spend time on what really matters, what is really human: arts, poetry, living in a way that is beautiful, cultivating relationships, making families, making homes. And so, yeah, I see that as a great, great possibility. So there, like, on the one, on one hand, like, I think what could do a lot is just helping people to see a glimmer of hope. You know, there is a way out. There always has been, and there always will be. We're capable of this, and there is great potential here.
I love that, Leah.
Yeah, but regardless, there's this whole issue of change, right? And change is hard, even if we're going in a positive direction. And this is, I think, why rites of passage exist, right? It's not just a funeral that's a rite of passage. It's coming of age, it's marriage, and even though, like, a marriage is supposed to be a great thing, it's often scary and traumatic as well, because it's change, right? And that's why we need rites of passage. And there's always, like, I think for every rite of passage, every change needs a sort of funeral, because there is something being lost. In order to gain something new, there has to be something that just is not gonna continue. And so, yeah, we are losing something, you know. We're losing something the way the people before us lost something when the automobile was invented, when the radio was invented. All these major technological changes were not merely additive. You know, something's always lost when something is gained and changed radically. So,
So I'm going to
okay,
finish.
so yeah, I was going to say a funeral, yes, would be correct. I think people getting together in groups, naming their anxieties, having a time to express whatever emotions come out in a safe environment, and as in a funeral, tell those stories about the past, and yeah, and then start thinking about the future, and warming up to it a little bit, you know, or at least
Well, we invite those who are listening to join the conversation, because we imagine all kinds of aspects, from digital storytelling to mental health support to art and music, exhibitions and displays, and many other creative endeavors. But I'm going to ask you to, let's close out. The conversation's been great. Your enthusiasm for the topic and the warmth that you bring to the conversation, especially given the context of what led you to this topic, is deeply moving. But I asked, I shared with you that the very last paragraph of your paper, I just found so beautiful and so moving. And I'm going to ask you to read it. It's just one paragraph as a way to close out our conversation.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't have it queued up perfectly. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for it. So yeah, these are final lines of my paper, the concluding paragraph. So I explain, you know, in an academic way, you know, what was my thesis again. You know, you restate your thesis, and I close off with what is more. I hope to have shown how Heidegger's meditations on mourning as a source of healing has bearing on our contemporary lives lived in technological modernity. Instead of shuffling off to the next task, Heidegger encourages us to pause and dwell in our grief, no matter its cause, whether it be the loss of a loved one or a generalized feeling of lostness in the world. For it is in this grief that we moderns come nearest to the truth of being, and it is in this grief that we may discover renewal.
May it be so. May we discover renewal. Thank you, Leah, for joining this first video conversation in this series. And for those of you listening, we'll provide a link to Leah's paper and to her LinkedIn profile so you can contact her for any follow-up. Thank you again, Leah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Teresa. It's been such a pleasure to talk about this. Yeah.
Bye for now, everyone.